Welcome. I'm David Levi Strauss, Chair of the Graduate Program in Art Criticism and Writing here at the School of Visual Arts. This is the first event in our Spring 2011 lecture series, and it'll be followed by critic and historian Johanna Burton on February 24th, art historian T.J. Clark on March 1st, and writer and critic Lucy Lepard on April 7th. Cuauhtémoc Medina, who is based in Mexico City, is an internationally known curator. He was the first curator of Latin American art at the Tate Modern in London, was a consultant on the 2002 Sao Paulo Biennale, the 2004 Liverpool Biennale, and the 2004 Carnegie International. And he curated the Mexican Pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 2009. And scholar, he holds a PhD in art history and theory from the University of Essex, and is a researcher in the Institute for Investigations in Aesthetics at the National Autonomous University in Mexico, which is perhaps the world's largest history of art department and certainly the most prestigious in Latin America. But I've been most interested in Cuauhtémoc for some time now as a writer. He's written well and provocatively on the work of many artists, including Francis Alise, Melanie Smith, and Graciela Iturbide. And he's written brilliant essays on topics ranging from postmodern theory to museology, urbanism, and globalization. His monthly column in Mexico's largest circulation quality newspaper, Reforma, has made him the most well-known art critic in the region. The 12th issue of Efflux Journal included his 11 theses on the contemporary, or the contemporary, in which he calls the institutions, media, and cultural structures of the contemporary art world, quote, the last refuge of political and intellectual radicalism. And he concludes that, quote, it may well be that contemporary art's ethical imperative is to deal with the ambivalence of the experience of emancipation. If art has indeed become the sanctuary of revolutionary thought, it is because it deals with the memory of a number of ambiguous interruptions. With this, we hopefully find an advantage to the constant collision of perfume and theory that we experience in contemporary art events around the world. Please welcome Cuauhtémoc Medina.
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to David Strauss and all the work to get me here from Annette at the SVA critical program. I am going to talk today more in the position of a curator than an art critic, and that means that I'm going to be talking from within two projects that I felt the need to explore and share with you in relation to the possibilities that can be open to working in probably the least loved of all the art settings, which is precisely the biennial system. What I will do in essence is go through a number of arguments around two interventions, one precisely the Mexican pavilion at the Venice Biennial in 2009 with the exhibition of Teresa Margolles' work. And I will also go into discussing some of the peculiarities of a project that is just closing now, that lasted a year, that took place in the city of Murcia in the south of Spain, that was titled Cannibal Dominos, or, in Spanish, Domino Cannibal. So I hope that, I can go through it. It's not going to be academic lecture, but more discussion of certain moments of practice. And of course, later on, I'll enjoy a lot to have the opportunity to discuss the cases with you. So I'll start with Teresa Margolles. Hopefully this, okay. From what is left to what appears. In 2009, I was commissioned to curate Teresa Margolles' what else could we speak about? An intervention for the Mexican pavilion in the Venice Biennial. The process leading to such project was not at all simple or straightforward. For starts, Mexico doesn't have a tradition of visual envoys to Venice. Lacking a permanent holding in the Giardini, a revolutionary country like Mexico was not part of the so-called concert of nations that is represented in the fancy neighborhood of exhibition sites that were handed precisely in the first decades of the 20th century. So the mere continuity of the pavilion has to be negotiated each time, which accounts for the fact that there have been only a few moments in the 1960s and just lately from 1997, where Mexico has actually have a particular exhibition in that event. In fact, at the moment, January 2011, the process of Mexican participation hasn't been entirely defined for the show, which is meant to open in 4 months' time. But this, as you will see, has a certain normality into it. I don't know to which point audiences, let alone professionals, are aware of the extreme heterogeneity of political and cultural structures and decision methods that make the Venice Biennial. As a composite of different national and official structures, by no means there's a standard system to appoint curators or artists. Each country officially represented in the biennial, either through cultural agencies, private organizations, or ministries, has either very transparent or very opaque methods to define who and how is going to have the task of producing the official envoys. Some of those are actually designated from the top. Others involve rather complex democratic systems, like in Canada, where even the short list is built from proposals coming from professionals. In the case of Mexico, there is no really a method to define who would go to Venice. In 2007, Rafael Lozano Hemmer sort of self-appointed himself. I'm not going to go too much into that, but basically the people working around Lozano Hemmer managed to convince the minister to actually apply for a pavilion, so that is what created the need now of having a pavilion in Venice. It was a matter of a very intelligent organization, which ultimately was not such a bad idea. So in 2007, there was a consortium of state and private institutions that joined under the leadership of the cultural section of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mexico, that started a process that included looking for a building to set the exhibition and another process to define what kind of event would be sent to the Italian event. Being Mexico, and given the lack of a structural organization behind the display, by October 2008, they were still having a number of consultations on which could be the way to arrive to define the envoy. I was, in fact, part of that consultation. And I openly argued back then that there was no room for the traditional ministerial commission, that there was a need to have some peer structure, no matter how half-baked, to perform the designation. My basic point was that the local Mexican cultural authorities didn't have enough legitimacy amongst the artists and members of the Mexican world to have the possibility of making this decision without having a certain professional backing. In any case, I was very surprised that sometime in the middle of December, that's half a year before the start of the biennial, a letter from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs arrived to my place, inviting me, amongst other 7 curators, to make proposals for an exhibition that could include several artists, and that was to be chosen precisely by a panel of colleagues, curators and museum directors. That method was, in fact, a great advance. An official national representation, an exhibition that was going to talk in an event as an official presentation of the country, was to be defined beyond the structures of ideological commitment coming from the different stances of the Mexican government. It was probably the first time in Mexican history that such space was open to a certain possible critical intervention. In fact, by that time, during those early discussions, I had already advanced to the officials of the Fine Arts Institute who had approached me what kind of artist I thought would work as a Mexican representative in Venice. For me, it was very clear that, in fact, it was a no-brainer, that Teresa Margolles would be the right artist to work with. The reasons for that were very clear to me, and in fact, I stated them in the project I sent. On the one hand, as I had the opportunity to attest several times along the years, Margolles was still an artist. I had troubles to be included in international exhibitions or collections of contemporary art around the world. She was still polemic enough to merit the inclusion in an event like Venice to actually break the ice and make it through into a proper international reading of her practices. The fact that she had been working for already 2 decades with human remains, both as a member of the CEMEFO, that is the Medical Forensic Service collective in the early 90s, and as a soloist from the year 1998, had not managed to establish the seriousness and depth of her intent. At the same time, ironically, it was hard to imagine another artist which the local contemporary art circles in Mexico would have found themselves more in agreement that would be a good candidate to stand for the artistic community. She was in a country that is characterized by very partisan takes in relation to contemporary practice. Somehow, the person that linked the different mafias of the Mexican world. Precisely because of the daring and unique approach of her methodologies, she enjoys unanimous appreciation. There was here, again, a need to bridge between 2 different sets of criteria, local and international, that call for the attempt to produce something in a context like Venice. But finally, and you will appreciate that through the presentation, there was the nature and the political implications of Teresa Margolles' recent work, which had abandoned the minute research of the life of the corpse, as it was represented in the activity and the aesthetic of the mortuary where she used to work, to explore the pervasive presence of death in the urban and social landscape that made, in my view, absolutely necessary to think that she would need to be the artist to present. Margolles' work, especially since the year 2004 to 2005, had actually become the main means in our small milieu of recording the tragic social conditions that had started to prevail in the north of Mexico, particularly during the so-called war on drugs that President Felipe Calderón had launched as the central policy of his administration. Given my critical stance towards the workings of identity and national representation in general, but more in particular, of the way those specific strategies appear within the context of the global cultural structures, but at the same time, my personal need to combine that with an affiliation to specific modes of political implication, I was convinced that structures such of national pavilions ought to be embraced in a critical way rather than walking away from them. The ethical and social conflict involving Margolles' art was the only way I could envision myself taking part in such a type of venue. In fact, during our exchange of ideas via email that winter, it happened to be that we were located at that time in different parts of the world, Teresa described immediately in her own words why she felt it necessary to address the question of the way death has become a pervading social condition in the north of Mexico in the kind of event we were competing for. And let me translate you a fragment from a letter of Teresa Margolles from around the 20th of December, 2008. I am interested in talking about what is happening in the Sinaloa state. 1,120 deaths just this year, and December is not finished. Every month are more corpses than the month before. 1,120 people, most of them youngsters, that are not there any longer. And even if it is corny to say it, they won't be in Christmas with their families. Just empty chairs, just the memory that in those cases is immediately transformed in revenge. To revenge the brother, the cousin, the friend, the son. I am also working with the meaning of blood. The question is, who's cleaning the blood from the streets? Of the hundreds of executions, of the bodies that are shot and left there. That was the last work I made in Krems in Austria. Clothes impregnated with blood, soaked in blood, but not any longer inside the mortuary during the process of the necropsy, but blood taken directly from the floor, where once the body is taken, stays like a trace, like the last refuge of a person. I don't need any longer to go to the morgue because the bodies are just dumped in the streets, end of quote. So in between different trips, via emails and telephone calls, and finally in a meeting we had in Madrid in early 2009, Margolles and I worked a project that we knew we had to be changing if we were selected, that originally involved a selection of the different works she had been producing in the previous years, involving the strategies of exploitation and exploration of the way violence had inundated our country with corpses. When we had finished writing that draft in January 8th, I had to hand it just a few days later, we still lacked a good title for the exhibition. Fortune is an ironical goddess, as you well may know, because I had just landed back in Mexico City when Teresa called me and asked me to check that day's edition of La Jornada newspaper. So in the first page of La Jornada, I read this news item. Ambassadors should point out that there is no chaos. Calderón. President Felipe Calderón instructed yesterday ambassadors and diplomatic staff to point out the reality of the country. Because it is not true that in Mexico, the civil population is being massacred in the streets and that there is social chaos. He admitted that the number of people killed is worrying and surprising, but all of the dead are clearly related to the struggle between the criminal groups for territories, and they also relate to the way they are losing against the police and their structures are weakening. As a result, he recommended to disseminate with pride that the country is leading a process of institutional recomposition and enjoys democratic stability. It is not a fake perception, he said. There's a climate of peace and quiet in the cities of the center of Mexico City. Mexico enjoys democratic governability and is able to reach agreements, end of quote. I was taken aback. In other days, when a Mexican president dictated an ideological line, when in Spanish we say dar la línea, he would at least abide to a set of unwritten good manners and would keep in the dark when instructing his employers what to say. He would actually describe what government officials were meant to think well away from the journalists. So I grabbed the phone and called the artist and told her in a rather defeatist tone, "Look, Teresa, the president is instructing the ambassadors to silence the information about violence in the country, so it is unlikely that a project like the one we are doing can be chosen. My gut feeling is that we should simply radicalize the project, knowing that we will be working for the archive, and then try to produce the show locally. I mean, at least we need to make sure that we leave the idea in the record." Teresa got angry in the other side of the line, and I heard her saying, "No way. What do they think they are? What else could we talk about?" I stopped her. "Tere, that's it. There you have the title. What else could we talk about?" So the possible reluctance one could have in participating in a biennial like Venice had totally vanished once we had a specific task. It was not only that we wanted to state our revulsion for the way Mexico had become the test tube for the biopolitics of security and misery that surround the so-called wars of the illegal substances. We had another motivation to work against the supposition that the President of Mexico was in charge of defining the image of Mexico, which involved also which could be the role of something like a national culture, inasmuch as it was and will be, certainly, one of the elements of what we describe as diplomatic efforts. Calderón was trying to instrumentalize the Mexican Foreign Service so as to repair the national prestige that was being impaired by the untasty behavior of people that were killing themselves to control the routes of smuggling drugs in the USA. After a few weeks, much to our surprise, in fact, the professional jury in charge of deciding about the projects opted for us. A panel of curators and museum directors had also the impression that this was the story that could convey what the country was and what could be actually described of it from the vantage point of the type of practices that we, for a decade, have been working around and in relation to the question of contemporary art. So, in the next months, the process of making this exhibition was surrounded by an important internal conflict. Already, the day when I was told about the appointment, I sent an email to Margolles that read like this: "My dear Tere, after a very agitated process that included official fears and businessmen that were really concerned about the decision of the jury, and a behavior that was not particularly clean on the part of one of the candidates, they finally acknowledged publicly that our project is the one chosen to go to Venice. I send you a big hug, knowing that we have lots to do, but ones that we have finally gone beyond the temptation of putting us to silence." Almost immediately, Teresa answered, "Very well, we're still in the game. It is a very difficult game with a very heavy backpack in our back." Writing down these notes, I linger on the last phrase by Teresa, for what this backpack carried was indeed very complex. In fact, if you check the material published around the Mexican pavilion at the Venice Biennial, you will see how the logo of the Mexican Foreign Affairs Ministry and the Jumex collection that launched the event at the beginning silently disappear by the time the publications occurred in Venice. Both withdrew in silence, with a certain naivete around the possible impact of the public functions. But rather than making a fuss in the newspapers about that, the artist and the curator decided to put that silence to good use as a means to force the remaining cultural agencies to collaborate with them and complete the project. I mean, rather than rushing to claim the success of Scandal, we took on the divisions that existed within the organizers so as to be able to pull out the show. I'm still enormously surprised, but also grateful, that the local journalists were unable to read the signs of what was indeed happening. That lack of information allowed us to work just fine. This, in a way, now that the process is well finished, is somehow indicative of the difference between curatorial work and what you would necessarily describe the role of the public intellectual. For the curator, the question of creating public sphere is always secondary to opening the possibilities that the artwork would actually produce in that public sphere, even if that noise has a different condition. In any case, by the time of the biennial, no Mexican official was, let me put it this way, officially present to represent the government, which I think is a rather unlikely situation in one of these events. Not even the cultural attaché in Italy. Sometime, also in the process, two of the members of the jury, a museum director of the Tamayo Museum and the head of the cultural section of the Foreign Affairs Ministry, had to quit their jobs, in great part out of the conflict produced internally by the clash between this project and the official line traced by the Mexican president. So the Mexican pavilion in Venice, in the Venice Biennial, was a case of an official representation without representation. The only reason it effectively took place was the fact that its process of selection was transferred to a professional panel, and that the nation state, different from what sometimes cultural analysts project, is not a homogeneous political entity. It involves lots of cracks, different agendas, different functions. It's a malfunctioning structure. So I have to argue, before going into telling you a little bit about the project, that despite the way Mexican cultural institutions have suffered under the conservative administrations that have governed Mexico in the last decade, all through the Teresa Margolles' project, I attested that the officials in places like the Fine Arts Institute, the National Council of the Arts, the National University, and even the patrons working in an organization called PAC, Patrons of Contemporary Art, tend to adjust their work to the duty of turning professional decisions into artistic production, independently of this ideological ring, which effectively is still under the mantle of the presidential office. One would need to say that it is only when something happens that the idea that art and culture are ineffectual shows actually to be an ideological strategy of the right wing to neutralize even the temptation of attributing it specific political and public powers. Similarly, it is only when our work manages to touch a raw nerve that the support of businessmen and corporations shows its limits, its compassive nature, let me put it that way, underscored in the notion of philanthropy, shows to be just a masquerade when it is a matter of taking sides in the absurd ideological traps of our times. So when political subversion appears, the structure of interests that surround our activities become to a certain extent transparent. That, of course, doesn't prevent us a certain space of maneuvering. Nonetheless, and I will insist on that, it is a matter of pride for this curator that during the participation of Mexico in the last Venice Biennial, some of our colleagues working within the state were the ones that managed to convey the notion of what autonomy means in our field. Anyway, at the end of the day, it is the mere existence of those cultural structures that is always being put into question by the narrow-mindedness and lack of political refinement of the way the Mexican government and even the political opinion tends to show in this, what we call the process of democratic transition. What was at stake, beyond the rather absurd presumption of the Mexican administration during the year 2009 to contain the information of what was happening in the drug wars in Mexico, was the legitimacy of cultural exportation. Margolles' project intervened in a significant state issue, namely, what is the aesthetic policy of the state? To which extent matters, what matters to citizens in relation to political sensibilities is what should be shown to the world, or if that is just a matter of governance. This is what I tried to argue in the catalog that was published about this exhibition. Quite rightly, a catalog was paid with the taxpayers' money. I will quote this and then I will simply go and explain you what we did. This spectral operation, appearance and summons to appear, has taken possession even of the rhetorical question that serves as the title of this intervention. What else could we talk about is, of course, the retort to a reprimand. The sentence encloses a visceral reaction to the expectation of the Mexican elites that for the sake of the national image or to safeguard the illusions of tourism, we should maintain a contrite silence about the indiscretion of society bent on a slaughter in such a noisy, immoderate, and public fashion. They wish, in reality, the only thing liable to silence the obligation to do and to speak out the present catastrophe will be the next one. The worst of experiencing history as a serial compulsion to disaster is that all too soon there will be something else to talk about. The next massacre, the future failed revolution, the fresh cycle of economic collapse, the renewed disappointment of democracy, environmental cataclysms galore, another looming pandemic. Just as the mounting deaths resulting from the drugs battles was all that could smother the outcry over the hundreds of women murdered in places like Ciudad Juarez. So the only way to break the spell of the beheadings in the north of the country was for Mexico City to become the source of infection of a new strain of global influenza, as happened in April and May 2009. Staggering from crisis to crisis, leading from one scandal to the next. But no dialogue is being mooted here. The curator would simply like to share his delight in the fact that the word scandal derives from the Greek skandalon, meaning stumbling block, as we shall soon see. So let me just explain you the nature of that intervention after just discussing these issues that are behind the scenes. The choice of the venue was a 15th, 16th century palace, the Ivanchich Rota Palace, located more or less in between Formosa and San Marco. It was a rather hidden place that actually had been abandoned for a number of decades. So the first decision Teresa Margolles did was to actually leave everything exactly as it stood, to prevent any process of cleaning or restoration, so as to preserve the significance of the dead air and the dirt and the accumulation of abandonment of that place. So when you would get into the show, the first thing you would find was this desk. You would be careful, you would actually find a label. And this was more or less the rhythm of the exhibition. There was nothing actually said. There were just small labels that would give you enough information. This was actually the place where the curatorial team had to be confined. The artist created a policy of silence where curators, invigilators, the artist herself were forbidden of taking anybody into the show, of explaining the show to anybody, of giving press statements inside the pavilion. We had to be sitting basically in this desk, and there was a label that actually explained that this desk was made of concrete with water that had been used to wash dead bodies of people killed in the border between Mexico and the USA. So you would go through a staircase into the palace, and I know you've been to this kind of event. People normally come pretty excited from the street. They come talking amongst themselves. They come somehow in a festive mood. People would walk inside, and for 3-4 rooms, they would actually find nothing. It was just empty, and you just move here. Sometimes they would actually find the floor wet. Sometimes not. And eventually, I'm trying to just to reconstruct the sequence of what we expected people to experience. They found a label on the wall and this text. So they would finally sort of notice that they had been walking in a space that involved a certain action, cleaning, and they were explaining that the floors had been cleaned with a mixture of water and blood from murdered people, and this was an action that was repeated daily. And in that moment, our expectations that they would actually start to value or to be able to decode the bare indications of that of those actions. There were there were buckets and I don't know how you call the mobs in the rooms, or sometimes if you would be lucky, you would actually see the action. Let me just show you an movie of one of those actions. So just from a purely technical point of view, the artist actually worked so as to create an action that would be very contained and at the same time very standard. The people that mopped the floor, especially during the opening weeks, were basically volunteers coming from the north of Mexico. Some of them artists that had been working with Teresa in the process of collecting the material she worked with. Others, at least a couple, people from specific activist groups. That was not informed, that was not conveyed. Probably she did it to the press. And there was no interaction between them and the audience beyond their work. And as I was telling you, it was, I mean, there was a certain performance, more or less conventionally announced, but that was something that developed a long time by 4 o'clock every day. Sometimes people would find the cleaners, other times they would simply not. Again, just as a matter of technical information, the material, the blood, was transported in a very specific way that Teresa long time has devised. She has basically, she collects, she and her collaborators collect the blood and the dust with pieces of clothes. They let them dry. And eventually, those clothes are boiled very lightly, a little bit like the way you would make some tea, so as to get the material back. So all the process of transportation was done manually. I mean, nothing was actually transported in any organized way. The curator and the artist brought stuff in their luggage. This, both because with the time and the situation we were experiencing, there was no real attempt or time to to make it in an organized way, but also because a long time Margolles finds it important that there's this very personal process. And the whole of this work intended to eventually leave a layer, although invisible, of the people remains on the floor. It was an attempt to add material rather than to retrieve it. So somehow this cleaning was operating in an inverse way. Let me go back to the PowerPoint to show you a couple of things. That process, for those that see it, involved, let's say, half of the space of the palace in the first floor. Oops. One of those failures. And then there was a certain narrative. With hindsight, both the artist and the curator have wondered to which extent they could actually have cut part of the rest of the work, something that we don't know for sure. But there were some interventions like this one that involved that a room that still had some plaster frames was used to display these clothes soaked in blood and dried that were, along the time of the biennial, being embroidered in golden thread with certain messages that the drug mafias leave next to the bodies of the people they execute. Very nasty messages, in fact. Margolles was interested to, of course, link the polarities of gold and blood in a certain kind of allegorical reference to what is happening in relation to this process. So there was this one that was the only one ready at the beginning that said to see, to listen, and to shut up. There were also a number of jewels that were made with glass that had been collected from places where people had been shot in their cars. Those jewels were used for display along Venice, but in the exhibition were always concealed in a safe that was on the wall and just indicated through a label so as to prevent their presence as a spectacle. And finally, there was a whole room in the ground floor occupied by a big curtain of clothes that were full of mud that through a water pump and a number of aspersors were somehow being slowly washed along the time. And that mud was also added into the mix that was used in the buckets. The original plan, and that's the explanation of the title, Recover Blood, was to actually have the clothes with blood into those machines. But there were reasons of conflict in relation to the possibility of having troubles with the police, the local police, in relation to questions of hygiene, that made Teresa switched into using the mud, these clothes that contain mud of places where people have been killed as well. And finally, there was an intervention in the exterior. You surely know that traditionally, there's nothing in the regulations about this. Official pavilions in Venice use the flag posts on the canals, and they usually have the national flag along with the Venice flag, and today the flag of the European Union. And she refused to have the Mexican flag, and instead she had just this cloth that was also red with blood. There was some friction about this particular work, again, out of the fear that this could cause some troubles with the local authorities. I mean, the concern was that because of the rain, eventually there would be claims that we could actually be jeopardizing the people in the boats that would be crossing beneath. But that eventually, that piece stayed there. Finally, there were a number of actions in the street outside of the pavilion, and there was no attempt to actually program them as something people could witness. You could either happen to encounter them or not. The first one was the distribution of 10,000 cards to cut cocaine, that all of them carried this photograph of a corpse of somebody who had been burnt as part of these drug wars. And the card was an object that Teresa Margolles decided to use again. She did a very, very small edition some years ago. She decided to use this idea in a mass scale so as to distribute it in the parties of the Venice Biennial, in the Giardini, so as to intervene the social spectacle. Of course, the card has an ambivalent character because it pretends to be a tool of drug consumption, but it's also trying to link the user with the violence that is a condition of his or her pleasure. There were showings of the jewels produced all around Venice. They were not programmed, they were not accompanied with any explanation. They were just trying to somehow disseminate as glimpses this sort of sample of drug bearing bad taste. And anyway, all along there were also a number of actions that were done in different places in Venice, including the use of these clothes in different ways. And there's one that, for certainly a certain Freudian reason, I was really interested in showing you, and I didn't include in my PowerPoint set, but luckily I have it. I should have it here, which was an intervention that was done before the exhibition in the Giardini. in the American pavilion, and it was called Embassy. And it consisted on a private installation that was later on printed in the booklet of the show of the American pavilion, with the doors and windows covered with these clothes of blood. Those especially of people that were killed in Ciudad Juarez, next to the border. And somehow the image intended to document both the intervention and also the fact that on the months when there's no exhibition, it is actually an official building of the USA that is completely abandoned and nobody's actually taking care. So as you could see, I mean, this was an attempt to politicize rather than reject the function of national intervention, of a national representation of the pavilion. And let me just move quickly, because we don't have so much time, to tell you about a different project. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm trying to look for my cursor. I will try to describe you rather quickly a completely different type of biennial intervention. It is what I've been doing all the way from January to December 2010 in the Curatorial project in Murcia. As you probably are well aware, the traditional format of the biennial is a festival, which actually involves a number of different participations of artists or different exhibitions happening at the same time. And for a long time, I was slightly obsessed with the fact that lots of these events around the world are promoted and ideologically constructed with the argument that they involve a number of structures of dialogue between the artworks and the communities, but above all, between the artists participating. And my impression was that, in generally speaking, most of these events are, on the contrary, a collection of monologues, where the interaction between artists is actually extremely low. So I thought on a model of trying to actually create a project where the question of the capacity of artists to discuss and intervene somebody else's work would be at the center of it, even if it would involve the production of structural interactions based on a certain level of violence or destruction. And I was locally invited to do a very small biennial, and I convinced the organization to take this model. So the model, titled Cannibal Dominos, consisted in actually inviting 7 artists along the year to produce new work on the basis of using just one space and then working on top or departing from or destroying the work of the artist before in a sequence of anthropophagic or cannibalistic moves. I was somehow trying to link in that structure both the fascination one has with artworks and exhibitions that involve a sequential structure. For instance, Roy Morris's project transformed continuously from 1969. And the number of experiments all the way from the surrealist that involve the attempt to create an intersubjective space of production. So this is what the first artist that initiated the series produced, and this was Jimmy Durham, who, as the initiator of this game, had somehow the opportunity of defining, by implication, the conceptual boundaries of the whole of the series. And what Jimmy Durham did through a number of explorations of the region of Murcia was to try to work in relation to the concept of the temple, the classical concept of the temple, which is a space from which the whole of a city or a civilization is built, that involves the demarcation of what is sacred against what is used by by men. Given that the exhibition actually was going to take place in this former church, the Verónica's church in Spain, he was tempted to precisely work on the question of the transition of objects that would actually encode the different forms of activity and the social environments of this region in relation, of course, to obsolescence, and to bring these objects into the exhibition space, trying to make them operate inside without invoking an artistic procedure, somehow trying to retain their condition of profane things. So as you can see, what Durham did involved both a collection of objects that relate to moments of production, traces of different forms of refused objects, but he also worked to create a certain kind of reading of the space of this church, basically in relation to the setting of cables and pipes connecting some of the most important symbolic elements in the church. For instance, this crypt, where of course some of the nuns are still buried, from which he created broken lines into the altar space. And along that, he also collected drawings and graffitis from the street that he copied into the church. So these bases, this project, this first installation, was a month later intervened by Spanish artist Cristina Lucas, who decided to work on the basis of the concept of going beyond these general ready-made aesthetics into trying to transit towards what she described as the popular aesthetics of the ready-made. So what she did was actually to perform a whole Via Crucis, she said, where these objects left by Jimmy Durham were underwent a number of different economical and practical transformations. So she first did a number of actions, all of them recorded in video and photography, involving the mere act of contemplating this installation. Then she actually desecrated it, destroyed it, and recorded different actions involving the dismantling of Jimmy Durham's show. Then she recycled in the sense of classifying the material leftovers. And then she asked the workers, installers, help her to transfigure, to transform those elements into useful objects, basically benches. And more centrally, she took all these oil barrels so as to try to turn them into barbecue structures. Let me just go over. She arrived to a fifth stage where she banalized them, displaying them in a park so as to create an enclosure. And the central action that she called sacrificed was a press conference turned into a barbecue, where the artist forced the journalist to engage with her in a quid pro quo structure. She taken from The Silence of the Lamb, of course. She would accept to answer their questions as long as they would accept her questions and answer them. So all that involved then a number of other stations. That is, of course, her peregrination back into the church. She decided to take this photograph as representative of that. And then she installed this whole thing, creating a big cross of barbecues in the center of the space, and a number of stations telling the story of her intervention along the wall, somehow following the narrative structure of a Catholic church. Then another 6 weeks after, in March, the Bruce High Quality Foundation from New York arrived, and what they did was basically a tabula rasa. They took everything out on the basis of arguing that they were going to actually create a moment of amnesia, and somehow alluding the film by Chris Marker, Sans Soleil. They made a film of their trip from Paris into Murcia, going through particularly Portbou, alluding somehow to the death of Walter Benjamin and this region of Spain. And the way they installed that film involved also creating a certain section of the road as if they would actually have the end of their way into the church. The next participant was Kendall Gears, the South African artist, who somehow angry with what Americans had done. He actually told them that they had behaved just like the USA, that would destroy everything and make a road in the center. He came to try to reconstruct all the objects that had been used by Jimmy Durham, but he invited a performer, is Hekere, so as to work in darkness into this show, so as to decide how to install the objects they created. And finally, he did a performance that was done originally in complete darkness, where she activated this exhibition. Now, the condition of the artist imposed was that that performance was not to be recorded by any means except the curator's writing of it as an event. He only wanted a written memory of it. I'm not showing you elements of that installation. The installation, as you can see, retrieved the grills of the barbecues so as to make both cages and the cross. He brought a different Rupestrian cave image to substitute Jimmy Durham's graffitis, and in general, he tried to evoke a certain animistic intervention into that space. By September, it was the turn of Tania Bruguera, and Tania Bruguera departed from a very specific event. In the 29th of September, the Spanish unions have called for a general strike to protest against the economic measures imposed by the socialist government so as to supposedly get out of the crisis. So she started by making a number of political quotations in space. As you can see, there's a number of murals that involve things from Bingo's racing feast for the IWW in 1917 to a red flag carried by the hands of the Mona Lisa, and there were some specific quotations to Vera Mujina's statue of the proletarian and the peasant in Moscow, now mutilated in the style of Jose Clemente Orozco's interventions in his own murals. She also added a number of images that the students working with her somehow devised as what they would assume was the language of social realism. And she also, with permission, remade a piece by Kendall Gears, Between, titled Withheld 1993, which is this between that has a brick inside as if it were the aestheticization of street violence. So all that she made so as to call for audience participation. She published ads calling people to come during the general strike so they could paint freely and they were provided material. And this is what actually happened. As you can see, this is some views of the end result. There was a significant amount of voluntary interventions. There were layers and layers of paint where people were both just having a try at the idea of painting in a church and also alluding to very specific political questions that were produced by the general strike and by the specific contradictions of the Spanish region. So that, in a way, was like the artist delegating the function of intervention to the audience in a very direct way. Of course, Tania Bruguera, as a Cuban, was somehow implying the uselessness of political art as a genre with all these gestures. And then there was an intervention of Brazilian artist Rivane Noisbanda. There was something ironical in the way in which Bruguera had preempted participatory work. And what Rivane did was to work departing from something very, very abstract, which is her, the way she's been quoting the spaces in Latin American expotos, the architecture that is represented behind these Catholic paintings that are normally small paintings that depict a miracle and that are painted so as to give testimony of the existence of a miracle. So she created these spaces inside the church, leaving the murals of Tania Bruguera behind, just slightly whitened, these very, very painterly abstract spaces that somehow turned those popular paintings into penetrable environments. And along that, she also showed a specific film of hers called The Tenant. So those very strict painterly spaces were eventually accompanied with a new participatory piece. This church happens to have a very classical monastery device. It has a double rail in the back the nuns were not allowed to go into the world, so they had to witness the mass from behind that rail. So she asked people to actually leave little notes with their fears attached to that rail. And by the end of the month, there was a significant collection. I don't have a photograph of that, of all the fears people left. And finally, in December, Francis Alice arrived, and he made somehow process of documentation of the show within the show. So what he did was he asked the organizers to provide him with images of the previous projects. Somehow, a little bit by chance, there were almost 150. And he, of course, all this without the organizers being aware, he organized those images following Julio Cortázar's direction table of the novel Hopshot. I don't know if you know, this is one of the most important experimental novels of Latin American literature that can be read in different combinations of chapters, including the one that Cortázar suggests. And on the basis of this order, he showed it to several characters: the curator, one of the artists, Cristina Lucas, the butcher in the market across the road, the photographer, and a Spanish art critic, so as to somehow force them to make a narrative interrupted by these illogical flux of images. So, of course, the work, as you can see, was shown basically in monitors, and those narratives are essentially narratives that are where the people trying to give a testimony are struggling to rescue the notion of sense from a very specific set of circumstances, and he made this hopshot game in the center of the church, somehow to symbolize the whole operation. So, I mean, this was, I mean, in essence, a totally different type of biennial intervention. It is more like an intervened exhibition structure that is playing with the way in which the expectations of artistic intervention are convened. I think that what I was really interested in doing was to create a situation where people would actually have to get outside of the normal processes of working, where the artist would actually have to try to interpret in doing what the other artists did, and in general to try to formulate a different way in which this notion of an international exhibition would work, where the notion of representation of artist practices will be in question. I was sort of asked some months ago to be part of a selection process, and I accepted, that has not started. I already complained like 3 times that this is just ridiculous, that people are not going to be able to pull out an exhibition. I have to say that beyond the specific political questions that my work with Teresa involved, it was really, really absurd to try to pull out a pavilion in Venice in 4 months. Is the kind of things that somehow I know have some normalcy in some places of the earth, but shouldn't happen. And this time they are going to make it really hard. So, on the one hand, it is kind of difficult not to give a certain support to the fact that this very same cultural officials that suffered the last process were eager to actually try again to have a pavilion and to raise the money and to allocate the resources. But I don't know what's happening that they haven't been able to start. So the answer is maybe there will be a pavilion, and I don't think that one can suggest that there's a connection between the lack of planning and the lack of organization and what happened specifically politically last time. It really is just that for a number of structural reasons, sometimes the Mexican cultural structure is not being able to make things in a professional, organized way. So I don't know what is going to happen. Maybe nothing. It's kind of absurd, no? Anyway.
I was just wondering, I've been so interested in Teresa Margolles' work, and could you talk a little bit more of why she's interested in always depicting death in terms of like an imprint or a trace, or like it's never, although it is quite direct in terms of photography of death, but I'm really interested in like the ethical implications of how it's always like these remnants of, like it's either always an imprint or a trace or like something that's...
Yeah, I mean, methodologically the trace is in her work from very early on. The first works that involve the usage of sheets impregnated with people's blood, then just basically almost like a figurative imprint, are from 1995. And of course, one reason is simply that she's always worked with means to connect the inside of the mortuary with the outside, and in this case, the outside of the street with the inside of the exhibition space. So the trace is the quasi signature that actually is able to produce that movement. But I don't know how to address the question of what would be the ethical implications of that, because one would assume that, of course, from a theoretical point of view, because of the significance of the trace in the deconstructive tradition, it is, I mean, the case that many other works, the trace involves an attempt to produce a certain ethical distance that will avoid the questions of the attempt to capture the other subject within a certain structural representation. But in Teresa's work, that capturing occurs. And I also would argue that her work is not bounded by moral limits, but it involves a certain ethical exploration that sometimes has to do with actually having gone beyond what would be ethically and humanly acceptable. I mean, there's a certain sense in which the way she works with limits is actually somehow trying to find where they are rather than trying to respect them. I don't think it is a matter of transgression, but a matter of a empirical exploration of where they actually are in practice. Sometimes that is just a documentation of what are the effective limits of a practice that is not being ethically organized. Sometimes it is a personal pursuit. But somehow, I mean, in the past I made the argument that some of the works of artists like her or Santiago Sierra and sometimes Javier Teles involved in the 90s an acceptance of the breaking with the expectations of an ethical practice in the South. So I don't know exactly how to address that question. In this case, I'm clear that one task she was trying to fulfill, because nobody was trying to fulfill it at that time, was the function of trying to have a certain elaboration of mourning, and the less she would actually explain people she was doing that, the better for her. And the fact that in Venice she managed to communicate that function with others was something that I can sort of witness that troubled her a lot. It was not something that she expected. So that, of course, is implied in the work. I would say that that's the ethical stance, that the ethical stance has had to do with trying to deal with this level tragedy, both in the specific works and the general approach is accepted today. But one thing that I'm very clear, and that is very interesting to me, and is also very, marks a certain limit to what I can do and can elaborate, is that she's not developing it with an informed programmatic stance coming from having read Levinas or Delot. I mean, I actually respect some people that have that point of departure. I would say that Doris Salcedo is clearly somebody whose work is informed by that lineage in an active way. But Doris is coming from a different world. I mean, the origins of the Semefo group are those of a death metal punk rock group from the east of Mexico City that turned into art at the same time, all other people started to do that. So the presuppositions of that origins are different. But I think it's an interesting question that maybe simply that I haven't been able to sort out for myself ever.
I was struck by your proposition to Teresa to radicalize your project.
For the archive. Okay.
Yeah, for the archive. Her question about trace then made me think that you and Teresa are very compatible in this point, that you also wanted to leave a trace of your attempt. But I was wondering, are you forced to do this a lot? Have you done this before? Did you propose this very spontaneously? Is there a history in countries where censorship, or at least there's a larger sensitivity towards political, to politicizing national representation, that this is a form of strategy to leave a record for the archive?
Okay, let me start from saying that there's always censorship, and probably there should be. I mean, I'm not a liberal in the sense that I think that you can naively think that there's a dichotomic opposition between the good guys that are for freedom and the others. Every structure involves a moment where there's a tension between power and control, and that is what we call censorship. I think that there's an argument by, another argument by St. Augustine, that, no, it's not St. Augustine, but the argument is censorship is the need of repressing an argument because of a higher reason. Anyway, I think there's a very interesting essay by Derrida on the question that reaches a similar conclusion. So it's true that there are different structures of censorship, and the classical structure of censorship didn't apply in this case. At the end of the day, the Mexican government had to pull out the show, and as I tried candidly to explain, artist and curator, in this case probably curator more, made a choice which involved that it was more important to pull out the exhibition than to claim the scandal. Now, this is a very interesting point because you made me realize something. Yes, there are a couple of times that there are things that we've just made for the archive. I don't think that's a necessarily strange idea. I think that many people do. I think that if you would actually check what happens when you have historical shows, you actually get things from the archive that were left there because somebody left a record. It's not a trace, it's a record. I think that's a different stance. I was trained as a historian, so I have this certain weakness to leave some evidence. I always have the feeling that there will be a PhD in Wisconsin, it's always an American, in the year 2050 that is going to realize that in that day this shit happened. I admit it. I do play that game. It's a nice game. I think a friend of mine, Olivier de Boas, died 3 years ago. He left us the horrible duty of trying to preserve his archives without losing anything. And when you open the files in the computer, he actually has gossip of everybody around recorded there. So I think that that's not, I think it's a very interesting situation that many people just do without really noticing. A letter always arrives to the destination, no matter how long it takes. That's something that you do. In this particular case, what I'm basically trying to tell Teresa is that we were going to try to make the argument totally explicit because we were not going to make it. That meant that the project that I gave to the Foreign Affairs Ministry quoted the president saying that we were not going to do this. You understand what I mean? That is what goes. So when we were accepted, during the brief time the Foreign Affairs Ministry was on, there was an indication that everything was okay except putting the quotation of the president in the catalog. So you may say that once we were going to do the show, I accepted the limit that I had trespassed in the archive. Now, by the time the catalog was made, which of course was kind of 10 days before the opening, and it was ready for the opening, the quote came back. So I think that we were not, because of the way in which this was not played in the public sphere, and the fact that the existence of the artwork was more important than the story, I can say that we were more interested in the moment of silence than in the censorship. So it's not so important in this case. But there are other situations not so directly involved with the structure of central power where that has happened. But it's not particularly unique. I think that a good deal of curatorial work has to do, and I always have this feeling, of lots of people in institutions that are always in a very difficult balance of allowing things to happen when I'm playing the fool sometimes. And that is much as important as people in positions of power or in institutions that actually stop things from happening that should have taken place. So that game is all pervading. But yeah, you're right that there was something. I feel a little bit guilty about the idea that instead of comforting Teresa saying, it's okay, we are going to make it, don't worry. What I said is, let's write it down for the file. It's strange, yeah.
Cuauhtémoc, I think we need to
Thank you.
lead the rest for the archive.
I'm sorry for the length of this. Thank you very much.